One of my favorite genres of YouTube videos is FromSoft virgins playing their first Souls game. It's not a matter of delighting in their pain or agony. No, what's so great about these videos is watching new people go through the same journey that many of us have. At first, it's unlike any game you've played before. There's unusual opacity, as the game doesn't explain that much about the mechanics or the story or anything. The combat is extremely difficult, and you get absolutely brutalized. But slowly things start to click. You learn patterns, you learn strategies, and you become addicted to the struggle for and ultimate acquisition of mastery, that dopamine rush that Miyazaki has said is foundational to his philosophy of game design. That said, there are ways new players can make that journey a bit less painful. It actually makes me think of a moment in Elden Ring towards the end of the game, when you have to fight Gideon Ofnir, the putatively all-knowing. Gideon believes he's communed mentally with Marika, and he attempts to thwart us, telling us that Marika actually wants us to struggle unto eternity. The great irony is that he's wrong. The so-called all-knowing doesn't know the most important secret at the heart of the Golden Order, which is that Marika and Radagon are one. It's Radagon, not Marika, who doesn't want us to succeed. So too in From Software games, no one wants players to struggle unto eternity, but rather to struggle and then succeed. I've tried to explain some of the ways to do so in my beginner guide videos, but I've neglected to mention perhaps the ultimate rule. Don't run away. We can think about this from two angles: during the learning phase and during the proper engagement phase. In both regards, running away is a bad strategy. Starting with your first encounter with a boss, none of us is typically going to perform fantastically. But even without the expectation of victory, there are serious disadvantages to attempting to learn a boss from a distance. For one, learning a boss isn't just about seeing its various moves. It's about your response to those moves. Engaging with a moveset builds those neural connections and that muscle memory far more effectively than merely observing it. Souls gaming is not a spectator sport, so while you might live longer at a distance, you'll also make the distance between you and mastery longer than it needs to be. Getting up in a boss's face without knowing it will indeed lead to more damage and death, but each minute of damage is going to reap far greater rewards than each minute running away. Another disadvantage to maintaining distance during the learning phase is, in many cases, that you are ironically not learning the boss's moves at all. This is because bosses react to you differently depending on your position in the arena. When you run away, they might spend some time chasing you, during which you're learning nothing, or they might unleash their long-range attacks. For a caster build, this isn't entirely unedifying, but one way or another, most players will eventually need to engage at least periodically at close range to defeat a boss. If you run away during the learning phase, your exposure to these moves winds up being curtailed, and in your attempt to learn safely, you've actually self-sabotaged. If we take my practice for my Fortisax no-hit run as an example, I have to deal with the frustration of basically always being two-shotted, but it's ultimately worth it. Being up close, I can first learn when to engage with and disengage with the head. I can learn the timing of the claw swipes, which was my biggest impediment because of their weirdly timed electric follow-ups. I can learn precisely when his head is going to be low enough to the ground to hit it, and when quick follow-ups will render those windows more dangerous than they might initially appear. Although it's annoying to die a lot, being up close, I'm learning way more than if I stayed at range, when he'd either spam me with fire attacks or dive bomb me to attempt to close any distance I created. Eventually, the effort pays off, and you begin to internalize all the moving pieces so that they become more legible and more natural to you. But the adage, "don't run away," extends beyond the educational period. It's also integral to good execution of fighting itself. As I've said in some of my historical analysis videos, it's pretty clear that, by at least the time of Bloodborne, From Software has foregrounded aggressive playstyle, and their boss' responses to player inputs reflect this expectation. When you spend too much time at a distance, a number of problems can emerge. First, melee players are going to have a hard time doing that much damage. It should be fairly obvious, but when you're not playing with ranged weapons, you need to be fairly close to deal damage, and Souls bosses are often designed to be very good at chipping away your health at a rate faster than you can chip away theirs if you don't play aggressively. This slow war of attrition is generally not favorable to a player, although it is of course possible. For example, I killed Slave Nightgale hitless with his terrible crossbow for a challenge run, but it took me quite a long time and many attempts because the longer a fight drags on, the greater the margin for error. Bosses have a number of active strategies to deal with running away. For one, they have their own range attacks that they can use in some cases. They can also rebuff attempts to disengage by deploying distance closing moves. Slave Nightgale, if you spend too much time at medium distance, will launch into various acrobatic vaults to close the gap, and will outright teleport if you spend too much time at an even greater distance. The Abyss Watchers glide forward, rush you, or somersault toward you, regardless of how much you try to run away. Between the tremendous range of his weapons, compounded by thrust attacks and his arena-wide aerial attacks, Mesmer forces engagement whether you like it or not. Sometimes, bosses will actually run away from you. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I believe this is a form of anti-spamming safeguard. But this disengagement still slots into this general don't run away rule, as you should try to rejoin the fray as soon as possible. Sister Frida, for example, disappears, and if you wait around, she'll reappear suddenly for a fatal scythe attack. But if you run toward her, you'll strip her of her invisibility, catch her in a state of stasis, and have ample opportunity to deal damage. Margit tends to wait around quite a bit when he zips away, perhaps throwing a few daggers, but you are advised to run up to him to keep the pressure on him. Other times, you can afford to stand around a bit because the boss will re-engage quickly enough. Mesmer, again, is a pretty good example. You'll find him at a distance not infrequently, but he won't take long to run up to you or close the distance, so it's not essential that you immediately run back to him all the time. Like most rules, however, there are exceptions. Certain isolated moves do require running away, but these are far and few between and don't tend to be frequently deployed by the bosses who do use them. Soul of Cinder's phase transition requires distance to avoid, as does Placidusax's signature lightning bolt explosion move. You can also create distance sparingly and judiciously to bait out favorable attacks. The Godskin Apostle, for example, chucks projectiles at you when you create enough distance from him, but he'll also execute a jump attack with a relatively long cooldown. Given that many of his moves at close range can roll catch you with immediate follow-ups, baiting out this jump attack is a great way to create more counterattack windows than he normally wants to give you. So distance can be manipulated in certain cases to your favor, but at the end of the day, running away and playing defensively is less likely to garner good results than staying up close and putting pressure on enemies, which is why I think it's the most fundamental rule of how one should approach combat. Let me know in the comments what your number one Soulsborne rule is, and give me a like if you enjoyed. As always, thanks so much for watching.